Good day, everyone. My name is Romola Adeola, and I lead the Global Engagement Network on Internal Displacement in Africa. The network is committed to bridging the gap in research and policy around the issue of internal displacement. As we know, there has been significant attention to issues around forced displacement globally at various levels of governance, including at the level of the United Nations, at the level of the African Union, within various sub-regional institutions across the continent, and of course, very importantly, at the national level as well. But in all of these engagements, there has significantly arisen the need for building momentum to the issue to ensure that there is sustained action around the issue of internal displacement. And of course, in relation to the pertinence of policy and research, the GENIDA project emerged, which is an international collaboration between the University of Pretoria and the University of London, funded by the UK Research and Innovation. And it's over the last couple of months, GENIDA has been involved in working with policymakers, but more importantly as well working with academics and working to build momentum at the national level in the furtherance of internal displacement in Africa. Of course, you might know very much about the news in relation to the population of persons affected across the continent. And really, when we speak about the population here, we're speaking about persons in excess of about 16 to 17 million persons, especially when we speak about the issue of conflict, which is a primary driver of internal displacement in Africa. But conflict is not the only driver of internal displacement in Africa. There are various drivers in internal displacement. And in fact, when you look at the United Nations Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, which was developed in 1998, but more importantly as well the African Union Convention for the Protection and Assistance of Internally Displaced Persons in Africa, also known as the Kampala Convention, which is adopted by the African Union Assembly, which is the Assembly of Heads of State and Government on the continent, in 2009 in Kampala. When you look at this particular frameworks, you are quickly drawn to the pertinent reflection of these frameworks around the need not just to build sustainable solutions to the issue of internal displacement, but then also to ensure that when we are building the solutions, we're very intentional about strategies towards the furtherance of IDP issues. And of course, we've seen that in terms of the definition of what an IDP is, these are persons or group of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee their homes or places of arbitrary residence. And of course, have not crossed international borders, so being very pertinent in terms of how we look at internal displacement. But when you look at these frameworks, you're quickly drawn to the fact that there is a very significant emphasis on the need for state action, but also for actions by various stakeholders, not least, of course, across the states, across various levels of governance, in addressing the issue of internal displacement. But then you're also drawn to the imperativeness for the need to ensure that actors beyond the state as well are held to account. But then coming back to the issue of root causes, very importantly, when we look at these frameworks, we also see that various root causes of internal displacement also relate to, also include natural disasters. We have the issue of climate change, which is emphasized in the Kampala Convention. We also have the issue of harmful practices, which is very significantly reflected in the Kampala Convention as well, and of course quite innovative way of building on pertinent root causes that we've seen across the continent over the last couple of decades. But the point being made here is that there are various root causes of internal displacement across the continent, but then in terms of the statistics, the data on them, we don't really have as much, in fact. And one could say, but why don't we have as much data on these issues? Now, we must first begin by saying that the data we have around conflict, persons affected by conflict, is very useful and important, and of course it gives us that premise on which to understand the magnitude of the problem in relation to conflict, and of course giving us that pertinent understanding that this is also an issue that is prevalent across various regions, various countries in the continent. But it's important for us to have those data also in relation to natural disasters, in relation to climate change, in relation to agro practices. Very importantly, because having those data could help us in terms of planning strategic solutions to these issues. But we really can't begin to speak about having data, if we don't really understand the issues inherent in these forms of root causes of internal displacement. And indeed, that is why there's a need for research around these issues, because the research we gather would help us understand what issues are there. So I'll give an example. For instance, when we speak about climate change and internal displacement, there's often the question around how do we even know that climate change is resulting in internal displacement, and that's a question that perhaps comes from a place that there's a need for research around. But what we've seen over the last couple of decades are just four pertinent issues that really come up. So we see slow onset disasters, and we see the exacerbation of these onset disasters given the impact of climate change. We also see sudden onset disasters, and this is really where we see a lot of momentum being built around, especially because we do have torrential rainfalls in various parts of the continent. We have hurricanes, and these are issues that really just draw attention to the need for disaster management and response. But then the exacerbation of it being as a result of climate change, and the fact that this also leads to situations of internal displacement, makes us then have significant need to build that momentum around protecting persons who are affected by climate change in the context of internal displacement. But then also we see climate conflict, and this is really where we start seeing the fact that scarcity of resources due to climate change then creates conflicts between certain populations. So we've seen this, for instance, between agrarian and pastoralist populations in some parts of society, and oftentimes these issues are not significantly discussed within the paradigm of the context really of climate change and internal displacement, which is very important for us to begin to discuss in order to develop durable solutions to these issues going forward. But more importantly, we also see climate projects intersecting with situations of development-induced displacement. So, for instance, responses to climate change, such as climate mitigation and climate adaptation, very important. But then also these situations resulting in situations of internal displacement, which need also to be addressed, from a position of prevention, but more importantly, needs to be addressed from the position of protection of those being displaced. And of course, the argument around the fact that we do need this climate change project in order to effectively respond to the impact of climate change is a legitimate one. But in the process of doing this project, it is important for us not to displace persons. And of course, balancing those imperatives are very useful in the context of internal displacement. But then when we look at these situations, now we see that, of course, we are now beginning to identify some pertinent situations of climate change and internal displacement intersections. And having such knowledge formations is imperative and integral to building sustainable solutions, which is also where the Global Engagement Network on Internal Displacement seeks to significantly create a level of knowledge around. But more importantly, it should show us that it is important also to begin to build national solutions and really build data around these issues across the continent, in various countries, because we also need to be very contextual in how we develop our solutions, as much as we are also holistic across the continent in order, and of course globally, in order to ensure that our actions resound within the significant global paradigm of change and durable solutions and building sustainable solutions. And importantly as well, it is important that when we think through solutions and we reflect on solutions, we are also mindful of the need to ensure that we put IDPs, internal displaced persons, at the center of whatever interventions we have. It's important for us to put them at the center of whatever interventions we have, because these are the persons that are integral to whatever solutions that we eventually give. So it would matter, for instance, how much we involve IDPs in order to ensure that we do not create protracted situations of internal displacement. But it will also matter in terms of how we involve IDPs to ensure that when we build sustainable solutions, these solutions are also owned by these persons, and they do not create other forms of displacement, given the fact that they are not accepted within societies and communities. And of course, while we build solutions, it is important for us to also remember host communities as well. Perhaps in situations where IDPs decide to locally integrate in order to ensure that we build social cohesion within those regions. But then, speaking about durable solutions to the issue of internal displacement, it's important to speak about this and to really highlight the fact that we have three forms of solutions. So we have local integration, we have return, and we have resettlement. And really, when we speak about these durable solutions, it's important for us to also emphasize that IDPs have to be at the center of this, and they need to choose what solutions they want. Of course, we've seen in various countries where IDPs decide to return back to the place of their homes or places of habitual residence, perhaps in situations of conflict when the conflict is over. But it's important that in terms of arriving at the solutions, it's not something that is forced on them, but rather it's something they decide by themselves in order to ensure that it's much more sustainable and that it essentially helps them to rebuild their livelihood capacities and support. And so what should matter most in terms of how we even move forward in the conversation across the continent, but then also globally, is what can you do in ensuring that internally displaced persons are protected in Africa? Of course, we have the frameworks, which is very important and gives us a basis on which to begin the conversation. But then beyond the frameworks, what do you want to do within your own space, within your own vantage points? That's very important as well in building solutions to internal displacement. And it's important to emphasize that when we speak about the rights of IDPs, the Kampala Convention, for instance, speaks very strongly about the rights not to be arbitrarily displaced. And this is really one that encapsulates the context of internal displacement to ensure that in situations of internal displacement, IDPs are protected, and not just that they are protected as the starting point, but then prevention is really the starting point, where state has to ensure that it provides the adequate structures that are important in order to ensure that situations of internal displacement do not occur. But when they occur, there is a need to ensure that protection is given in accordance to the Kampala Convention, but then also one that contextually looks at the nature of the internal displacement. And I'll give an example. So, for instance, you have a person who has been displaced by an harmful practice in a particular community, and in order to ensure that that person also receives protection, the Kampala Convention, of course, specifically speaks about certain provisions in terms of protection assistance, but it's also important for the state to ensure that there's psychosocial support integrally within the context of providing protection for those persons. And of course, psychosocial support is important when we also think about other forms of displacement, such as armed conflict or even natural disasters, because such situations could also create pertinent challenges. But overall, it is important that the context of displacement also informs pertinent solutions.